Well, if there's one thing that we should pick up from the last couple of chapters that we've looked at in our study of the book of Acts is that God is in charge. I think the way that I had put it, I mean, just as far as the immediate context of what we were dealing with in Acts chapter 27, is the fact that the storm that Paul and the rest of the shipmates experienced was God's storm, and God was bringing these things together, bringing the storm together, bringing the situation together to give an opportunity to show other people who He is, and even before that time. Even when you from the time of Paul's arrest and even up to this point, I think we see a situation where no matter what happens, we see that God is in charge and that God is in control. And so I want to highlight that specifically as we get ready to delve into chapter 28, which is the last chapter of the book of Acts. And I want to explore how God comes forth, and again, this is going to be through His servant, the Apostle Paul, how the fact that he is in charge kind of just shines through as he and everybody else are land, so to speak, on the island of Malta after they've experienced the shipwreck. For some time, I've looked at chapters like Acts chapter 28, and I have to ask the question, what is Luke's, and by extension, because he's moved along by the Holy Spirit, what is the Holy Spirit's purpose of putting what we see in Acts chapter 28 in Scripture? What is His purpose? What are some of the things that we can see and draw from? And I think that a lot of what we see in Acts chapter 28 is connected to a lot of what we've been seeing in past chapters of this book. And so I really want to highlight some of that this episode and just show how God reveals Himself as one who is in charge. So I think that we'll make a few interesting observations. I think we're in for a good discussion. Hope you stay with us. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures. Well, if you want an example, besides Acts chapter 28, and again, I guess I should say even from what we've seen in previous chapters before Acts chapter 28, but if you want to see a good example of what it looks like for God to be in charge, read in the book of Exodus, the 10 plagues. The one thing that you have to understand about the 10 plagues is that these weren't just random plagues that God just decided, I'll go ahead and unleash this on the Egyptians, and maybe what should I decide to do? I'll go ahead and unleash this plague on the Egyptians. These weren't randomly selected things that God just decided to do to the Egyptian people when Pharaoh refused to let the people go. Each of those plagues, in some way, shape, or form, spoke against and demonstrated power against the so-called gods and deities that the Egyptians worshipped, the plethora of gods that they acknowledged and that they bowed down to. So really, the 10 plagues were not just a punishment against the Egyptian people because of their oppression of the Israelites. That's part of it, but another part of that, embedded in that, was this whole idea that God is a God above all gods, and especially the gods that the Egyptians worshipped. And so does that sort of display who is in charge of all things, who is over all things, a creator of all things? Absolutely. And so I think that's one of the things that makes the 10 plagues so magnificent in the story. If you understand that, if you have at least that understanding, maybe not even the specifics of what God He's demonstrating power against, but even just the fact that he is going toe to toe against a God, which we all know that those gods don't exist, but in the minds of the Egyptians they do. And here comes God in defense of His people, and He shows them who He is by His power, which totally outshines in a very, very huge way these gods, these so-called gods that the Egyptians had tried to worship. Or not tried to worship, they did worship, even though they weren't worshiping anything that was real. And, that sort of thing shows that God is in charge, to say the least. When you come to a chapter like Acts chapter 28, you kind of sort of have the same thing, except we're not dealing with anything where there's that antagonistic sort of mentality or attitude that you had in Exodus with the Egyptians, namely and more specifically from Pharaoh himself. But in Acts chapter 28, you are dealing with people who are pagans. You are dealing with people who have a worship of some sort, or a system of some sort, or even a knowledge of gods that they acknowledge and they believe as gods. And so when the Apostle Paul and the rest of the people from the ship that was shipwrecked land on Malta, excuse me, when they land on Malta, I don't think they are ready for what they're in store for, what they'll be in store for. And what we're going to see, though, is that by the end of the passage that we're going to see, that we're going to look at today, we see something that's very positive. Again, like I said, if you could do a comparison with what you see in Egypt with the Egyptians, those were some hard-hearted people. And again, specifically and namely, Pharaoh. I think you had some of the Egyptians who were just kind of thinking, Pharaoh, what are you doing? Don't you see that this, that you can't beat this God? I think that what goes on in chapter 28, at least the first half of this chapter that we're going to look at, we see a display of God in charge. God in charge over against anything else that that these people on the island of Malta would believe, as far as deities go and as far as deities are concerned. And I think that just picks right up where we left off, and what we've been looking at consistently, not just in the immediate context of just coming out of a storm and seeing God reveal himself in saving the lives of every single person on that ship and showing himself that way, but even more than that, just kind of seeing how we as readers have been seeing God at work even before then. And specifically, even before chapter 27, if you go back even from chapter 21 up to this point, seeing situations where we have an understanding that God is in charge and that he is the one who's calling the shots. And what's going to be great about what we see here in this chapter, in chapter 28, is that you see some very positive results. So many times, in the book of Acts, throughout the book, not just in the last 6, 7, or 8 chapters or so, but throughout the book of Acts, yes, we have seen some things where we see positive results happen, but we've gotten so used to the negative things that happen as well. In any of Paul's missionary journeys, even if you go way, way back to the beginning to right after Pentecost, how it doesn't take long for persecution to set in. So the apostles and everybody else were experiencing persecution and everything like that. And so you see this constant cycle of trouble, animosity, and even when you're talking about the apostle Paul, constant dangers, it seems like. And, we see all of that. Here in chapter 28, we're going to see a lot of positive things with a lack of negative things as far as persecution goes. And that's not to say that nothing bad happened in the midst of Paul's ministry. Maybe it did, and Luke just didn't record it because the Holy Spirit didn't lead him to do that. I don't know. But it's kind of refreshing to see just what we see with this ministry that is launched and unleashed by the Apostle Paul when he's on the island of Malta. And again, Malta being the island that Paul and everybody else, the centurions, the prisoners, the sailors, everybody else, come to after the shipwreck when they're out at sea. Okay, so speaking of that, let's just remind ourselves again just where we are, because again, as we know, Paul has been on his way to Rome, and he's on a boat with 276 people, who again their destination is Rome, and they've just a short order of review here, because we don't want to go into the painful details of everything here. Again, if you want to know more of the details, you can listen to those 2 episodes if you haven't heard them before. But let's just say this, is that the trip from Caesarea to Rome hasn't been an easy one. And even where we left off now, we're still not at Rome. And like I said, we're at Malta now. But basically, Paul and everybody else have been traveling on a boat at sea during a time when it's very dangerous to do so. And that danger obviously manifested itself, most notably in a northeaster that came and drove the ship kind of in a northwesterly direction. They tried to stay away from the Syrtis, which is more on a southwestern course, and where a lot of ships were known to wreck. So they were able to avoid that, but they're still at a loss of control and everything. And so what's most notable, I don't want to focus so much on the nautical stuff that we kind of highlighted and talked about, but I want to just bring to your mind again some of the other things that we talked about, just as it relates to this being God's storm, and how God, just kind of brought things together to create this situation, including the storm, where, pretty much in the middle of all of this, after so much time and not seeing daylight or stars or anything like that, and being just pounded every which way by the wind and the waves and everything, that people lost hope of being saved. And it's at that moment that you kind of get a sense that God brings Paul into the situation to use him as an instrument to be able to display the kind of God that he serves. And so Paul is one who is able to say that, hey, I had a vision from the Lord or from an angel of the Lord that said that not one of you on this boat, and that includes me and everybody else on the ship, we are going to come out of this okay. We are going to survive this. We're going to lose the ship, but we're gonna be okay, and we're gonna run aground, and we're gonna come up on some island. So this is something that Paul is predicting is going to happen. And as we see by the end of chapter 27, everything happened the way that Paul said it would. And so Paul even says verbally, he says, I have confidence, I have faith that this is all going to turn out the way that God said it would. And so one of the things that I pointed out is that with Paul, you not only have the verbal confidence expressed by him, saying that I believe that God is going to bring us through just as he said he was going to, but you have a demonstration of that faith as well. As we saw last time, one of the things that we saw is that after 14 nights of being out there and being in total suspense, you have a ship full of people who haven't eaten. And it's understandable why they haven't eaten, because they're living in suspense around the clock, pretty much 24/7. And so Paul, after having a hand in stopping an incident of sailors trying to escape, Paul gives some encouragement and urges these people to eat, and again reminds them that nobody's going to be lost. And so here you see Paul sitting down and starting to eat. He gives thanks in the midst of them all and starts to eat. And so you have this idea that by that display of faith, which, I mean, in simple terms seems like a simple display, but it has a very powerful effect. Everybody else sees Paul do this, and they're encouraged, Scripture says. And so they themselves eat as well. And so as we went forward in the text, we saw that the shipwreck that had been predicted happened. And so God's protective hands on Paul in the midst of everything, because the soldiers are going to eliminate the prisoners, because the prisoners would be able to escape, and then that would be their own heads if they let the prisoners escape. But the centurion, wanting to protect Paul, stops the soldiers from doing this. And so he ordered people who were able to swim to the island, the nearby island that they knew was nearby, and that those who couldn't, to hang on to planks from the broken ship and everything and make their way there. And everybody was accounted for. By the time that this whole thing is done, by the end of chapter 27, everybody appears to be safe. And so at the very end of verse 44, it says, "And so it was that all were brought safely to land." Okay, just as God had said, and just as Paul had said, was revealed to him. And so that shows the credibility of God and the credibility of Paul as God's servant. Now, Paul had been building up credibility all along through this whole thing, and you see that as well throughout this whole thing. So that's where we left off, and so we're stuck now in the situation where they still haven't made their destination. They still haven't made it to Rome yet, but they'll get there. I know by the time we end today, they get there. But for now, they're on an island called Malta. So here's what I want to do. Let's go ahead. Usually most of the time I read just sections at a time of the verses that we're going to cover. Let me go ahead and just read the whole passage here, just because I feel like reading the whole passage, So I'm specifically what we're looking at here is verses 1 through 16. Okay, that's the area that I'm looking to cover for this time in the Word. And so chapter 28, starting in verse 1, and this is what it says. It says, "After we were brought safely through, we then learned that the island was called Malta. The native people showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and welcomed us all, because it had begun to rain and was cold. When Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and put them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened on his hand. When the native people saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, 'No doubt this man is a murderer. Though he has escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live.' He, however, shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. They were waiting for him to swell up or suddenly fall down dead, but when they had waited a long time and saw no misfortune come to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. Now in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the chief man of the island, named Publius, who received us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days. It happened that the father of Publius lay sick with fever and dysentery, and Paul visited him and prayed, and putting his hands on him, healed him. And when this had taken place, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases also came and were cured. They also honored us greatly, and when we were about to sail, they put on board whatever we needed. After 3 months, we set sail in a ship that had wintered in the island, a ship of Alexandria with the twin gods as a figurehead. Putting in at Syracuse, we stayed there for 3 days. And from there, we made a circuit and arrived at Rhegium. And after 1 day, a south wind sprang up, and on the second day, we came to Puteoli. There, we found brothers and were invited to stay with them for 7 days. And so we came to Rome. And the brothers there, when they heard about us, came as far as the Forum of Appius and 3 taverns, and to meet us. On seeing them, Paul thanked God and took courage. And when we came into Rome, Paul was allowed to stay by himself with the soldier who guarded him." Excuse me. Reading that whole thing through that whole time, I felt like I had something in my throat and was trying to keep from coughing. But I might cough here 1 or 2 times throughout this time because it's like there's something in my throat, and I don't have water in here with me. Sometimes I do, but not this time. But that's okay. Anyway, here again. Excuse me. So there you have the situation of what goes on in Malta. So we can break this up in a few scenes here. First, let's consider the first 6 verses of chapter 24, and these first 6 verses. And again, what we're looking at here is we're looking at a situation where God comes out as a God who is in charge. Okay, God who is above all other things, above nature, above everything else, even above the gods that other people believed in. And so you get in the first 6 verses kind of this setup for what we see later on in verses 7 and following, just as it relates to what ends up happening there on the island of Malta. But as it says there, they learn in verse 1 that the island that they had landed on was called Malta. So that's what they learned. And so in verse 2, it says, "The native people showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and welcomed us all, because it had begun to rain and was cold. Okay, so yeah, certainly they escaped the water, after the shipwreck. You have to understand that the climate, the weather at that time wasn't ideal either. So, rain started to come and everything, and it said that it was cold too. Now remember, this is we're approaching here probably mid-November, early November, mid-November, if not a little bit earlier. So it's not warm outside. And so when it's starting to rain and cold and it's cold, and obviously you come on this new island, you're new there, you don't know what's going on, you have no place to stay, you really don't have any materials where you can, ready materials where you can pitch tents and things like that. I mean, obviously coming up on the island, as much help as you can get would be appreciated. And so you have the native people here. Now, what's so fascinating here is that these native people, we don't know how many there were that came out, but you would imagine they see this large group of people, because remember, again, the number of people that we have that was on this ship was 276 people. So that's a lot of people to take care of. But for these native people, in the original, kind of along the lines of barbarians is what they're called, but that just simply means people who didn't speak Greek. They come out and they show, as it says there in the text, unusual kindness. And I guess maybe it's unusual because they just seem to go all out of their way to help such a large group of people. And these are people from an island that is not all that big. The whole island of Malta, if I remember the dimensions correctly, I believe it's 18 miles long and 8 miles wide. So that's not a really big island compared to other islands that are out in the sea. And so they do what they can to build a fire for them and everything like that. In a way, I can kind of identify with this, not so much of people being hospitable and helpful in a time when you're uncomfortable or you're wet or cold or something like that, but just the mere extension of hospitality. In both times when I've been out of the country in Asia, and just going to India and China and places, the people there are incredibly hospitable, and they will go out of your way to make sure that you're comfortable. Because they take you in as their guests, and and they want to make sure that you are comfortable, and that you're well fed, and that sort of thing. And so, really, it's truly amazing, just kind of that aspect of their culture that I was able to see when I was over there. This has been a while ago, several years ago, but I kind of get that sense here. And these are towards strangers. They don't know specifically who these people are. They just see them, coming out of the water after experiencing a shipwreck. And I suppose hospitality of some sort isn't unusual. I mean, you put anybody in that situation. You see people who have just come off of a shipwreck, and they have nowhere else to go. What else are you going to do? But there's still a sense of amazement, just given the number of people that they're reaching out to help. And building a fire so that they're all comfortable, and making sure that they're warm and everything like that. And so in a way, I guess you can kind of see this is God's blessing over all of this as well. God not only saves them from the storm and preserves all of their lives, but through these native people, I guess you could say, make sure that they're comfortable and everything like that. Otherwise, they would still be in a situation that's not ideal. And I guess they're still in a situation that's not ideal, but I mean, it makes it easier to handle when you have people taking care of you, especially when you're on an island and you're not from there and everything. And so, it's just a really good display that we see here from the native people. Now, that's just a small part of what we see here. That's not really a lesson in itself. That's part of the reason that Luke is laying this out, but it is good to observe. a lot of this is just a good setup for what we see going on here. And what we see here is that Paul is inserting himself here as a servant. You have all these people who are taking care of him and everybody else, but here you see Paul actively gathering sticks, and you would assume that that's for maintaining the fire and everything like that. So Paul is coming off as a servant and wanting to help the natives help everybody else, just as it relates to creating warmth and comfort and things like that. But anyway, when you look at verse 3, it says, when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and put them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened on his hand. So a viper being a poisonous snake of some kind. He was somehow hidden within that bundle of sticks. Maybe the color of the viper blended into the bundle of sticks or whatever, and so Paul didn't notice it. And so when he puts the bundle of sticks on the fire, driven out by the heat, the viper comes up and bites Paul on the hand. And it wasn't just a simple bite. As it says there, it fastened on his hand. So you can imagine that Paul has his hand there, and just there's just this viper that's just dangling from there. And his fangs are sinking in, and he's not letting go. But you understand that this is we're talking about a viper. This is a poisonous snake, and so there he is with the snake hanging from his hand. And so in verse 4, now this is interesting, because in verse 4 it says, when the native people saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, no doubt this man is a murderer. Though he has escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live. So we get a little bit of an insight on the belief systems of these native people. They did have a sense of right and wrong, and that's not surprising. Everybody does to a certain extent. But they were people who understood how justice worked, or how justice should work. Now, what's interesting, though, and this isn't necessarily altogether unique necessarily, but you see that they have this idea, this understanding that gods of some sort would look out for people and enact justice against people who did wrong, and that from a human perspective, even though it looks like somebody would escape that, the gods aren't going to let that happen, okay? And so whatever happens to that person, they have it coming to them because justice has inserted himself into the whole situation and taking care of the person who deserves death or punishment or whatever the case may be. So that's what you have here. And so, and also in a certain way, it's kind of interesting because any sort of incident, a bad incident or a tragedy, at least in the minds of these people, in their minds, it equates to this person must be a bad person of some sort. Now, it's interesting. They pinpointed specifically what they thought Paul was, just based on what happened to him. Not just that he was a bad guy, but that he was a murderer, okay? And so here they are. They say, according to their belief system, they're thinking if you're a bad person, if you've done something bad, something bad is going to happen to you because the gods are not going to let that happen. And I keep saying the gods or God or a god or something like that because justice is actually, and it's actually capitalized in my Bible. I think in some translations it might be lowercase, but really justice is the name of one of their gods. And so when they're saying justice has not allowed him to escape, they're actually talking about a proper noun, a specific God that they believed in. And so they're looking at Paul with this viper dangling from his hand, and they say, you see, here you have somebody who is a bad person, a murderer. Now, it's bad enough that Paul has had a lot of bad things spoken about him from his own Jewish brothers and sisters, back in Jerusalem and other places. And by golly, even when you get to Malta and you're with some native people, even then you can't escape some things that people are saying falsely about you. Now, of course, with them, it's a little bit more understandable because they're just meeting Paul. They don't know him from Adam. All they're going by, though, is what they see with their eyes and attaching it to what they believe in their belief system. And so, because of this viper that's now fastened itself to Paul's hand, they say, okay, this guy is a murderer. And how interesting it is, their thoughts go on, is that they've come in from this ship that's wrecked. And, he might think that this is his way of escape. They said, again, in the middle of that verse, it says, no doubt this man is a murderer. Though he has escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live. So in some sense, they may have been thinking, because the sea, of everything that had been happening out in the sea and the storms and everything like that, that was one attempt for Paul to get what's coming to him because of his quote unquote murderous ways. But he escaped that, but justice, the God, isn't going to allow him to escape, and so he just brings another way of getting rid of this bad character, this bad apple, this bad seed, by having a viper attack him and harm him. Okay, so that's their belief system. Now here's the thing, verse 5, it says, he, however, shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. And I just love how calm Paul seems to be in this whole thing. There's a viper on his hand, and assuming you understand what kind of snake is hanging off of your hand and that it's a poisonous snake, you might think, uh-oh, and you might start to panic and go out of control and stuff like that. But just from the way the text is written, the impression that you get is that Paul's like, okay, no big deal, and just kind of shakes the viper off, and the viper falls into the fire, and then there's no big deal. He doesn't seek any sort of medical attention. He doesn't do anything of the sort. It's just the impression that I get when I look at this is just like this was just a minor inconvenience. And Paul's like, oh, look, this poisonous snake, and then just shakes it off and then just goes about his regular way, which kind of says something. I mean, it's kind of interesting. I mean, was Paul the kind of person who knew that God would still protect him in all of this? I mean, the indications would show that it is. And in some sense, I think that would make sense. I mean, how would it look if Paul is one who has just told 276 people out on the sea, God is going to save us from the sea and from the storm and everything. He's going to preserve all our lives. And then how much sense would it make that as soon as they get there and they're building a fire, Paul gets bitten by a snake and he falls down and dies? Right? The one person who's following the one true God. I mean, that would kind of be weird. So maybe that's one thing that's going through Paul's mind, and maybe that's one of the reasons why he's not panicking. Who knows? But there are a couple of things here, at least from God's perspective, I think that we can draw from this. Now, of course, we can't get into the mind of God here. The scriptures, the Holy Spirit through Luke doesn't let us in on that. But just in thinking about this text over the past several days, you think about why it is Paul preserved in all of this after being bitten and nothing happens. I mean, this isn't a fluke thing. I think we all understand that this is a God thing. And, for the reason that I just mentioned, a couple of minutes ago, God said he was going to preserve the lives of the 276 men. He just did that. Well, how would it make any sense for Paul to immediately fall over and die after being bitten by a snake, after all of that? But, secondly, we just chalk it up to a simple matter that God is not done with Paul yet. He's just not done with Paul. God has more work for Paul to do, as we're going to see, and as we've already seen because we read the whole passage. As we see in the rest of this passage, Paul is going to be a very busy man, and God is still going to use him to unleash a ministry on an island full of people who do not know the Lord. Okay, so he's still in chains, but even as a man in chains, who is on an island and hasn't reached his destination of Rome yet, you still see somebody who is engaged in ministry. So no matter where he is and no matter what the situation is, I think it's still very noteworthy that we see an apostle of the Lord Jesus Christ himself who is intent on reaching other people and reaching out and giving the touch of God on people and into their lives. I just think that's amazing. Nothing ever got in Paul's way, which I think is interesting. So in all of this, the one thing from a God perspective is that God is not done with Paul yet, and we see that just as we see how the text unfolds. But another way that we see this is in some ways kind of connected to this, but to that previous point. But as another thing that we can consider is the fact that that this whole display of Paul not dying when it's natural for him to die really works into showing off who God is. This is kind of a setup for what we see later on here. Okay, so the fact that Paul doesn't die from this is going to work its way into what we see later on in this passage, in revealing more of who God is, the God that Paul himself worships. Okay, so as it says there in verse 6, it says they were waiting for him to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. Obviously you get the impression that they've seen stuff like this happen before, and they've seen they've seen with their own eyes the unfortunate incidents of people being bitten by poisonous snakes and then just dying very soon afterwards. So they're looking for specific symptoms here, and they know what to look for. Swelling up and stuff, or suddenly falling down and dying. But when they had waited a long time, how long we don't know, but a long time, when they had waited a long time and saw no misfortune come to him, they changed their minds and said that he was a god. So what a flip on their perspective. On one side, they're saying this guy must be a murderer. Otherwise, why would we see this happening where he gets bit by this viper? Now, when they see that nothing happens to him, they say, oh, we were wrong all along. This guy isn't a bad guy at all. In fact, he is a god. Now, whether this was something that they were proclaiming out loud or whether they were just saying this in a small group amongst themselves, the text doesn't say. I would imagine if this was something that they were declaring out loud and saying, man, this guy must be a god, we know that Paul would not be a big fan of that. This kind of has a flavor of Acts chapter 14 to it. You remember the scene there when Paul and Barnabas were on their first missionary journey. In chapter 14, when Paul healed a lame man, the people just went nuts and said the gods have come to us in human form, and they were bringing everything out with the intention of sacrificing to them and worshiping them. And Paul and Barnabas, they tore their clothes, they were distressed, and they tried to convince the people and say, no, we're men like you, everything like that. Now, you don't see a reaction like that from Paul. And again, maybe that's because they weren't proclaiming this out loud. Maybe they were just saying this among themselves and saying, hey, you check this guy out. You see, he got bit by a viper and nothing happened to him. I mean, maybe he's not a bad guy after all. He's just maybe he's a god. He must be a god. He must be a god. Whatever the case may be, though, I think the important thing that we see from what's laid out here is that belief that they believe that Paul is a god. Okay. But, obviously, if Paul knew about this, we know that that's not where he would want them to be, then that's not what he would want them to believe. And from a reader's perspective, we would look at this and we say, I hope that's not where their minds settle. I hope that they have a change of mind even further, because we know that Paul is not a god. There's only one God, and that's the God that Paul himself worships, the God of the Bible. And as readers, we would look at that. We would want to say, I hope that there's something else that happens that might contribute to changing their minds. And I think that you do see that in a certain sense. Now, in a lot of these areas in this text, it's not laid out explicitly, but I think if you read between the lines, you can see what God does in revealing himself for who he really is. And again, it shows that God himself is in charge, and he is in charge and is above all other gods. And what happens with Paul in his healing of Publius's father, I think plays a big part of that. And that's the second part of what we see here. The second part of this passage here, where we kind of see the beginning parts of this whole positive thing on the island of Malta just starting to unfold. Now, as the text goes on to say in verse 7, it says, now in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the chief man of the island named Publius. And, it's very well possible that Publius was an actual Roman. But whatever the case may be, he was the chief guy. So he was the guy who was in charge. He had lands belonging to him. You get a sense that maybe he had a substantial piece of that land on the island. And it says there in the middle of verse 7, he says, who received us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days. So the hospitality is extended even from the top man himself. And again, that Publius is willing to help out these 276 people who have come in from the sea. So as you get into verse 8, it's interesting how this is worded here. It happened that, and kind of hint, hint, wink, wink. It's like, you think that it has the whole idea of a coincidence, but I think from a spiritual and Christian perspective, I think we understand that God is orchestrating things to bring things about as well. Where it says it happened that the father of Publius lay sick with fever and dysentery. Now that doesn't sound fun. And I've actually known people who have suffered from dysentery before, and they'll tell you that dysentery is not something that you want to have. It's not fun by any means to have. But that's what his father was dealing with fever and dysentery. And Paul visited him and prayed and put his hands on him and healed him. Now, if you just read that through, just as I read it, there's a danger that you miss what just happened here. And you might think, well, what did I miss? I mean, Paul went in there, he laid his hand on them, and he healed them. I mean, what's there to miss? Keep in mind what we've just seen in the previous verses here. You have the situation now where people on that island are thinking that Paul is a god. And now here you have Paul, who, by the way, on his own initiative, it seems like here in these other verses that I just read here, on his own initiative goes and visits the father of Publius here. We're not talking about any sort of request or anything like that for him to go in and visit Publius's father and heal him. Which you might think that, which especially if there are people on that island who are starting to believe that Paul is a god, but that's not even the impression that you get. Paul takes the initiative, and on hearing about Publius's father, he himself goes in to this man who he's just met, or if he hasn't just met him, he's known him for a very short period of time, and it's almost like an extension of God's grace through the Apostle Paul. Who is this guy? I mean, there's nothing, again, we're dealing with people who are unbelievers, who have a pagan way of believing things. And there's no reason to think that Publius's father wasn't included in that whole belief system or didn't hold or carry that same mindset. Here you have Paul just taking the initiative, and just by the kindness, the grace of God that is extended through him, there's a healing that takes place. Now, what do we see here, though? Notice it says, and Paul visited him and prayed. And I think that is a big, big factor in what we see here, especially when we're dealing with a situation where the people of this island are beginning to think that Paul is a god. The fact that Paul prays to his God demonstrates that he himself is not a god, or at least it should. Ideally. So here comes Paul. He goes in and he prays, indicating that there is one more powerful than him. And it comes to show that Paul himself is not a god. And that, I believe that something like that speaks volumes. Now, it may have been a situation that's just between him and Publius's father. But as you see later on in the text, people hear about this, and before you know it, everybody else who has infirmities and diseases and stuff are coming to Paul. So word spread quickly. But the fact that Paul is one who prayed says something big, and I wouldn't doubt that Paul, in praying in the midst of these healing situations, that he does that with everybody else that he comes in contact with as well. Okay, so the fact that Paul prays should indicate to everybody else that there is one God, and he, Paul, is not it. He is not God, okay? Now, so in that sort of setup, we see that, there's something about Paul that's really unusual in the fact that that he was bitten by a snake, a poisonous snake, and he hasn't fallen down dead. And, so there's something to this guy. And if he's not a god, then what is it? Well, it must be having to do something with the God that he serves. And people know that Paul serves a God now because Paul is one who prayed. He prayed, and then he laid his hands on Publius's father and healed him. Okay. And so I think that speaks really big to the testimony of God. And that shows, listen, that shows that God is in charge of Paul, and he's in charge of everything else and everybody else, and just everything else having to do with the gods of Malta, whatever gods that they might believe. They at least believed in a God called justice, right? Now here's the thing: when seeing what people have now seen, you can imagine that one of the things that are going through their mind is that, okay, we've seen just in these two things alone extraordinary things happening. And now they start to take inventory, and what are the gods that we believe in? What have they done? And what kind of power have they displayed? Is it anything like we've seen here? And I think to them the answer would be no, which really gets them to strongly doubt, or maybe a seedling of a doubt initially, but I mean, like, they start to doubt, what their whole belief system was this whole time. And you see the effects of this whole thing in verse 9, where it says, "And when this had taken place, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases also came and were cured." Okay, so you have, and here's the thing. It's interesting because this looks a lot like what Jesus, what it looked like with Jesus in his ministry when he was on earth. And that's not surprising if we remember from way, 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 way back what we said at the very beginning of the study of the book of Acts. What we see cataloged in the book of Acts is the ministry of Christ continued. Whereas in the Gospels, you see the ministry of Christ when he was on earth. In Acts, you see the continuation of the ministry of Christ, except Christ is in heaven. And the ministry that is exercised from Christ, it happens through the Holy Spirit who works in his people. Okay? So in very similar ways, we see, things like this that are happening, things that are going on. Specifically even with Jesus, in places like, I believe it's in Mark chapter 2, and then even in some of the parallels in Matthew, where Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law, and then after that happens, you have people outside at the door waiting to be healed. The whole town comes out so that Jesus can heal, all these people with these diseases and cures. And you have to understand what you're most likely dealing with are people who have some sort of serious ailment of some sort. And we have to understand that their situation minus 21st century technological medical innovations here, that healthcare of any sort is not, you wouldn't expect anybody to get that as we would be used to in our culture today. Things that people suffer from now that can easily be cured by medicine and medical technology, people died from very commonly back at that time. So even some of the most common diseases that we might not be afraid of here in our day was pretty serious back then. And it would be you have people who, I would imagine some people, depending on their situation, out of desperation, coming to Paul and looking to be cured. We're not talking about hangnails. We're not just talking about a light headache. We're probably dealing with people who have been suffering from very serious, debilitating ailments, things that deeply affect everyday life and that sort of thing, or maybe things that are even life-threatening. And so Paul heals them all. Okay, so. And that's interesting because in every situation that where people come to Paul and say, "Please heal me," and Paul heals them, I think one thing that people would begin to see is that there is nothing outside of this guy's God's power that he cannot do. Which that would speak volumes, especially when you're dealing with a multitude of gods that people believe in. And in some of these systems, these gods had their own specialty. The god of this or the god of that. That's their only area. Here we see God covering all sorts of problems and infirmities and diseases. And God uses Paul, works through Paul to be able to bring a cure to all of this. Now, again, from these inhabitants' perspective, you would imagine that one of the things that they're thinking is that we've never seen anything like this, and nothing displayed like this from any of the gods that we know about. And so I would imagine that serves as a huge testimony, and it speaks volumes to them. And so what you see as an after effect of this In verse 10, it says, they also honored us greatly, and when we were about to sail, they put on board whatever we needed. Okay. Now you might get a hint, because you might speculate that along with this healing revival, I guess if you wanted to call it that, you might speculate that along with that, Paul had opportunities to preach the gospel. It's not mentioned there explicitly in the text, but knowing the Apostle Paul, I wouldn't be surprised if that was the case. In fact, anytime that you see things like this, usually a lot of times you have healing along with a presentation or a message of the gospel. In other places in Scripture, you see an example of that in different places. So certainly wouldn't be a surprise if people heard the gospel from Paul in the midst of this whole thing as they're getting healed. And a lot of those people may have come to faith, and so you see the outpouring of their graciousness and their generosity to Paul and everybody else as they get ready to sail away. That's certainly a possibility. There have been traditions that say that Paul did actually found a church there on Malta, and that Publius was its first pastor. There are traditions that say that, and that might not be too far off the mark. That may very well be true. Okay, and so through all of this, by the time their time at Malta gets done, which, as we see in the next verse, is 3 months. What you see here is as they're getting ready to sail, they put on board whatever they needed. And I think, God looking out for them again, and especially in a situation where they had lost so much in their when they experienced the shipwreck, or even before the ship was wrecked, and they were trying to survive out on the sea. They threw a whole bunch of things overboard. But anyway, so in verse 11 and following, you get to see they're getting ready to leave Malta, and they're finally going to make it to their destination of Rome. Okay, and so it says there, you get the time frame here of since they landed at Malta. It says after 3 months. So after 3 months have passed, again, they stay there because they're not going to go out, and nobody else is going to take their boat and go out in the time that was going on previously, because again, storms happen pretty frequently. So ships had wintered there, and remember we talked about the whole thing of ships and crew wintering at different places. After 3 months, that danger season is pretty much over. And so it says, after 3 months, we set sail in a ship that had wintered in the island, a ship of Alexandria with the twin gods as a figurehead. Now, here's the interesting thing. That's the only information that we have as far as the ship, and you wonder why Luke includes something like that in there. I mean, that detail doesn't seem to be anything of any value, except for the fact that what's being referred to, it's these twin gods that serve as a figurehead, are the gods Castor and Pollux, which, if I have my mythology correctly, are twin sons of Zeus. If I have my mythology information correct. And these were patrons of the sea, and so a lot of sailors look to these gods for protection on the seas, protection, guidance in navigation, and protection from violent storms. And so I think what's meant by having that being mentioned here, the reader is just kind of hit with this whole thing. How ironic. How this whole thing where you have this whole thing of this ship. This is a different ship, obviously, belonging to somebody else who, may look at this whole thing as, who had looked at this whole thing as these twin gods as gods who protected them from the sea. When we've just finished reading how God's protective hand was over 276 people in the midst of the storm. Who was truly the protector of the people on the seas? It was God himself, the true God, the one true God, and not these twin gods. So I think that's the reason why that's mentioned there. But in verse 12 it says, putting in at Syracuse, we stayed there stayed there for 3 days. Syracuse being on the western coast of Sicily. Okay, verse 13, and from there we made a circuit and arrived at Rhegium, which I believe is on the very tip of that. If you're looking at Italy, at the very tip of the boot, the shape of the boot at the very tip of there, and right by, it's still very close to Sicily, is Rhegium. And after one day, a south wind sprang up, and on the second day we came to Puteoli. there we found brothers and were invited to stay with them for 7 days. So that's nice, especially for somebody like Paul. Not to say that he didn't enjoy the company of Luke and Aristarchus. Remember, they're on this trip as well. But to be surrounded by more Christians, I think, is certainly a blessing. Not only to Paul, but also to the other two, Aristarchus and to Luke. And perhaps these other believers had interactions with these other people who had been on the ship as well. So you have more, and if that's the case, you have more encounters of these unbelievers on the ship with other believers, with other Christians, which I would hope and you would think has some sort of effect after everything that has happened, after everything that's gone on, the credibility of Paul, everything that happened on Malta. You just see this, this piling on of information, just experiencing God and what he does in and through his people. And again, all of this shows, yes, God is in charge. God is in charge of all things. They saw that out in sea. They saw that on the island of Malta. And I wish I knew specifically who of these people, if any of them, came to know the Lord. And it doesn't say here in the text, but I wouldn't be surprised if I get to heaven one day and run into one or two or three or a handful of these people who were on that boat and came to know the Lord through everything that was experienced. So they were there. They found brothers there and were invited to stay with them for 7 days. And so we came to Rome. Now, verse 15. And the brothers there, the brothers in Rome, when they heard about us, came as far as the Forum of Appius, which is kind of a market area on the way on the what's it called? The Way of Appius, I think is the name of that area, and 3 taverns, which is kind of a rest stop area, to meet us. And both of these, by the way, I believe the Forum of Appius is about 40 miles from Rome, and then the 3 taverns was about 33 miles. All of both of those south of Rome, along the western side of Italy. So look at this. So it says, and the brothers there, when they heard about us, came as far as the Forum of Appius and 3 taverns to meet us. So they were willing to travel some distance from those areas to Rome to meet with Paul and the other Christians who were actually there at Rome. It kind of gives you this understanding that Paul and the reputation of Paul had spread pretty widely, and even up to those areas. And you had people who were willing to go out there and see the Apostle Paul, maybe to hear him speak, or maybe to at least give encouragement and that sort of thing. The encouragement factor is something that you really see here, because in the middle of verse 15 it says, "On seeing them, Paul thanked God and took courage." Okay. And I think the reason why you see something like this, where you kind of get this sense that Paul is relieved and he thanks God, because you don't really see this whole thing where Paul thanks God, when they come in contact with the brothers at Puteoli. I'm sure that he did, but I think the reason why Luke kind of outlines this here after Paul arrives to Rome is because I think for someone like the Apostle Paul, he's not sure what sort of things have been heard about him and about the gospel and everything like that in places like Rome. And so he comes to Rome. He knows he's going to be in front of potential antagonists when he presents his case before Caesar, right? But who else is going to be there that might be potentially against him? We know that there were a lot of Jews back from where he came from who were doing all sorts of things to try and get rid of him. And so here it's just a refreshing thing, I think, for somebody like the Apostle Paul, to have these Christians, these brothers and sisters, come out and receive him kindly. And for that, he just thanks God, and he's greatly encouraged. And so, again, and listen, that shows that encouragement can go from another way in another direction as well. A lot of times we think encouragement, we might think of something that happens from the greater to the lesser, even though such distinctions actually in reality don't exist. But if we're thinking about somebody with the caliber of the Apostle Paul, we think of somebody who is intent on encouraging other people, from Paul to other people. Here we see the same thing, but in the other direction, where you have other people, nameless, faceless people that we're reading about, who encourage the Apostle Paul. He's encouraged by their reception of him. And I think it's important for us to realize and understand that that encouragement can go that way as well. Just as Paul had even said in the book of Romans in the first chapter, he says he's looking for mutual encouragement by one another's faith. It wasn't just one directional. It wasn't just one-sided. It was two-sided. It happened on both ends there. And so here you see Paul, who's greatly encouraged by the reception of these people, these Christians in Rome and in the surrounding areas. And so our passage ends in verse 16. It says, "And when we came into Rome, Paul was allowed to stay by himself with the soldier who guarded him." Now, we've seen a lot of blessings of this sort happen with Paul, where there's special accommodations that are made for him. We've seen that earlier in chapters, I believe it's 24 and things like that. And we kind of see the same thing here. He's not put in any sort of jail where all the other prisoners that have landed there go. He's kind of separated from them now. It seems like he's still in chains, but I mean he's kind of his own person now. The only thing is he's got a guard chained to him, which I think that if I were the Roman soldier, I wouldn't want that sort of situation. I don't want to be chained to somebody perpetually just to guard them. I mean, that doesn't sound like a lot of fun. But nevertheless, that's what we see. That's what we see. And so when we pick up next time, we're going to leave it here. And when we pick up next time, we're going to see how Paul ministers in Rome to people who come out to hear him. And Paul gains an audience, and we see that he gets mixed reviews here. Okay, and I think you see a summation of what you see in regular ministry, no matter what you're doing and whatever degree or whatever type of ministry that you're dealing with. So it's going to be very interesting to see how this unfolds and how the book of Acts ends with all of this that goes on, with Paul speaking to primarily and predominantly through most of this next passage that we're going to look at, mostly to Jews. Okay. And so we'll see how they react. We'll see what Paul says, and we'll see how the book of Acts comes to its conclusion. Yes, that's right. I anticipate that by the end of next time, we will have come to the end of the book of Acts. I intend on covering verse 17 to the end of the book next time. So if I play my cards right, if I time it out right, we'll probably be able to get it done, and thus we'll finish our journey through the book of Acts. So it's very exciting, and I hope you tune in for that. So like I said, we'll leave it here though for now. If you enjoy this show, and if you've come up on Loving the Scriptures for the first time and you would like to subscribe, I'd encourage you to subscribe to my show on Apple Podcasts, also on Google Play. You can also check out Loving the Scriptures on Twitter. You can follow me at LTScripts. That's LTSCRIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scripture. All right, friends, enjoyed this time with you. We'll be looking forward to bringing our study of the book of Acts to a conclusion, and just seeing just some of the things that we can extract and observe from there. I think we'll be in for some good things. My name is Steve Gill, and I hope to see you right back here next time. Bye now.